Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. James is a young man working in the technology field, living alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. He often tests new applications, especially tools related to artificial intelligence and translation. One day, while surfing the internet, James accidentally downloaded a strange voice translation application. What particularly caught his attention was that the application did not have many downloads. The description was vague and the comment section was hidden. But with a curious nature, James thought that perhaps this was just a test software. He decided to install it to explore. The application started with an extremely simple interface, just a round button in the middle of the screen. When James pressed it, it asked him to say any sentence to test the translation feature. He tried reading a basic English sentence, and the application immediately played back in French. The voice sounded like his own, but there was something more distorted and cold, as if his voice was copied but lacked vitality. James frowned, but still thought it was just a sound effect. That night, James continued testing the app. He read a longer paragraph in English, and the app translated it into Japanese. But when he paused, the app continued to play the sound. What was horrifying was that the following sentences were not his own. They were strange phrases, not part of the original text. James heard a cold voice, whispering in a language he didn't know, then gradually changing to clear English. "I know where you are." James's heart pounded. He immediately turned off the phone, telling himself it must be a bug. But when he looked at the screen, the app was still showing moving sound waves, as if it was recording non-stop. He was forced to uninstall the app. However, when he pressed the delete button, the screen immediately went black. Then a blood-red line appeared, "Cannot exit." James tried to restart the phone. After a few minutes, everything returned to normal. He sighed in relief, reassuring himself that it was just a software glitch. But in the quiet room, as soon as he put the phone down on the table, the device lit up and played his voice again, this time a dialogue he had never spoken. "You're listening to me," the voice said, sounding exactly like him, but with a strange drawl. "Don't think you can hide it." James shivered, cold sweat running down his forehead. He unplugged the charger, turned off the phone, and stuffed it into a drawer. That night, he couldn't sleep. The patter of rain outside the window only added to the heavy atmosphere. Every time the wind blew, he imagined whispers seeping through the cracks in the door. The next morning, James woke up, tired. He opened the drawer to check his phone, hoping it was all just a nightmare. But when he turned it on, the app was still there, despite his previous attempts to uninstall it. The app logo was no longer the original icon, but a blurry face, its white eyes staring straight at him. James was stunned, not knowing what to do. As time went on, the app became more and more strange. It began to reveal private secrets that James had never shared with anyone. Stories from his childhood, painful memories, and mistakes that he thought he had buried deep inside. All of it was spoken in his own voice, as if someone was controlling his entire mind through the phone. James tried turning off the internet, removing the SIM, and even using an old phone instead. But strangely, whenever he turned on his main device, the app still appeared. It was like a parasite that stuck to him, unable to be removed. And what scared him the most was that it started calling his name when he wasn't using it. "James, I saw you." His fear grew. James began to hear the app's voice even when he wasn't using it. The whispers echoed in the dark room, lingering as if from a faraway place. He told himself he was probably haunted, but the chilling feeling was real every night. The voice revealed more details about James's life, as if it knew everything about him. From the angle of his bedroom, his small habits, his most secret thoughts. James couldn't understand how an app could know so much. The climax came one night, when he was sitting at his desk. The app automatically opened and played back the words, "You are not alone." At the same time, James heard footsteps in the hallway. He rushed out to check, but the hallway was completely empty. Only the dim yellow light cast a shadow on the cold tile floor. James returned to his room, slammed the door, his heart pounding. He knew he couldn't ignore this anymore. There was something inside the app, a presence that didn't belong in this world. And it's getting closer and closer to his real life. James doesn't know what to do next, but he knows that this is just the beginning. The chilling scares from this voice translation app are just starting to show. James sat silently on the wooden chair, his eyes staring at the phone screen that was still dimly lit in the darkness. He didn't dare touch it anymore, but the curiosity and fear swirling in his heart made him unable to look away. The voice translation app, which originally had only one simple button, now had a new icon, like a small diary. Under that icon was a shaky, handwritten line, "My horror stories." James hesitantly touched it, his hand shaking as the interface opened. A long list appeared. Each entry was a recording with a strange title. "The day I cried in the classroom, the night I lied to my mother, the moment I wanted to disappear." James froze. He had never told anyone these things, and there were even memories he had tried to forget long ago. He tried to click on a section. Immediately, a familiar voice rang out, not a stranger's, but his 10-year-old voice. Choking with sobs, "I don't want to go to school anymore. They keep teasing me." James panicked. How could the app accurately recreate his childish voice, recounting that painful memory as if it were replaying? He quickly turned it off. But the next recording automatically opened. This time, it was his teenage voice. "I didn't break the vase. It wasn't my fault." James immediately remembered the time he lied to his mother to avoid punishment. Those details no one else could know except him. James's whole body was cold, his heart was pounding. Every word coming from the phone was like a knife cutting deep into his mind. The app didn't stop there. After each recording, it translated strange lines of text as if it was annotating the story of his life. But the creepy thing was that these words not only recalled old memories, but also wrote events that had never happened. A recording played James whispering, "I will die in this very room." Right below it was an automatic translation, November 24th. James had never uttered those words, and the date of the note was only a few weeks away. Panicking, James threw the phone on the bed, his heart pounding so hard it made him suffocate. But the screen remained on. The voice continued to ring incessantly. The room suddenly became cramped. The cold air enveloped him. He was cornered, his ears ringing from the sound of his own voice. James mustered up the courage to pull out the battery, hoping to end it all. But strangely, when the battery fell to the floor, the phone remained on. The sound waves continued to run on the screen. The recordings turned into a jumble of whispers, as if 100 people were talking at the same time in an unfamiliar language. In the chaos, James heard a clear sentence: "You will not escape." That night, James almost went crazy. He took a hammer and smashed the phone into pieces. But when dawn broke, he opened the drawer to make sure it was gone, and right before his eyes, the phone was intact inside, lit up as if it had never been destroyed. The screen displayed a message: "We are not done yet, James." James shivered, his hands shaking. He began to believe that this was no longer a normal application, but a door to some dark world. It had clung to him, using his voice to create creepy horror stories, delving into secrets that he could not escape. He decided to leave the apartment, taking the phone with him and going to an electronics store in the city center. The technician who heard him just smiled awkwardly and said, "Maybe you're too stressed. Any app can be uninstalled." James handed the phone to him to check. But as soon as the cable was plugged in, the computer screens in the store flashed at the same time, displaying the same line: "He belongs to us." The technician turned pale, quickly unplugged the cable, and returned the phone to James without saying another word. On the way back, James felt like he was being watched. From the bus window, he saw a reflection behind him that did not match his actions. When he turned around, the seats were empty. Only a cold breeze passed by. The phone in his pocket vibrated incessantly, emitting a distorted laugh. James knew that things were getting out of control. This app was not only exploiting his memories, but also weaving dark stories, turning them into a curse that surrounded him. And deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. Other terrifying horror stories are still waiting for him ahead, little by little dragging him into the abyss. James has not found the answer yet, but he knows one thing for sure: there must be a way to escape this hellish game before it's too late. James returned to his apartment with a heavy heart. Everything seemed to be spinning into a spiral with no way out. The strange app not only took away his peace, but also sowed ghost stories into every breath of life. Sitting on the bed, James held his head, trying to convince himself that it was all just an illusion, that he was too stressed. But as the night fell, the creepy sounds began again. The phone remained on the table, but the speaker emitted soft whispers. At first it was the sound of wind, the sound of rain, then gradually turned into distant moans. James leaned closer, his heart beating fast. In the whisper, he clearly heard a sentence: "James, you can't escape." This time, the voice was no longer just his voice, but also had other tones, strange and mournful, like souls were using the phone as a bridge to communicate. He tried to unplug the power cord, turn off the phone, but the screen was still on, showing a blurry image. It was no longer the app interface, but an image of a long, dark hallway, flickering with dim light. James rubbed his eyes, his heart pounding. How could a voice translation app broadcast images from elsewhere? He reached out to touch the screen, and immediately, the sound inside changed. Voices rang out, mixed with many tones. There were women whispering in a strange language, men's growling, children sobbing, all mixed together to form a creepy chorus. Then, from the chaos, a clear voice rang out: "We've been here for a long time, and you're the key." James shakily put down the phone, but the sound still echoed throughout the room. That night, James couldn't sleep. He curled up on his bed, surrounded by ghost stories that played continuously. When he closed his eyes, images flashed through his mind: a figure hanging in a dark room, a pale hand pressed against the glass door, eyeless eyes staring at him. James jumped up, turned on the lights all over the house, but those shadows still lingered in the corners of his eyes. He thought about throwing the phone out the window, But when he picked it up, the screen showed his own face, but distorted and pale. The face opened its mouth, whispering, "If you throw me away, we will really come." James let go. The phone fell to the floor. But the screen did not break. The light became brighter, as if in defiance, in desperation. James sought out an old friend, Mark, who believed in spiritual things. When he heard James's story, Mark frowned. "Maybe your phone has become a conduit. That app is not simply software. It could be a portal to another world. The ghost stories you hear are not just sounds, but memories of trapped souls." James was skeptical, but could not deny what he had experienced. Mark advised him to take the phone to an abandoned church in the suburbs, which was once famous for its mysterious stories. Although scared, James agreed. That night, the two of them set out. It was raining heavily, the sound of raindrops falling on the tin roof adding to the eerie atmosphere. When they entered the old church, the wind whistled through the broken windows and rusty wind chimes. James placed the phone on the dusty altar. Immediately, the screen lit up. Emitting blurry images, they saw silhouettes standing crowded together, their faces lifeless, their eyes empty. Chaotic sounds filled the room. Crying, wild laughter, people calling James's name. The whole church seemed to vibrate with the sound waves. Mark stepped back, his face pale. He shouted, "James, turn it off, quickly." James rushed forward, but the phone seemed to be stuck to the altar. He tried to lift it, but the more he tried, the brighter the screen became, and the silhouettes came closer. One of them reached out, his long fingers piercing through the light, touching James's shoulder. He screamed loudly, a cold feeling running down his spine. At that moment, the phone made a small explosion. The screen went black. The room fell into a deadly silence. James gasped, his whole body trembling. Mark looked at him, his eyes filled with worry. "See, James, this is no longer a joke. If you don't find a way to cut it off, these ghost stories will never let you go." James nodded, but deep down, he understood one thing. Even though the phone had temporarily stopped, the connection was not over. And he was afraid that one day, those souls would step out of the screen and into the real world. James didn't know what to do, but he understood one thing. The ghost stories were just the beginning. The door was still open, and behind it, more terrible secrets awaited. After the night at the abandoned church, James and Mark thought things had calmed down. The phone lay still. The screen was black, no longer emitting any strange sounds. James took it back to his apartment, carefully put it in a locked drawer. He told himself that perhaps those ghost stories were just a haunting memory. But deep down, James knew that everything was not over. In the following days, James tried to return to normal life. He went to work, met his colleagues, told himself that he had escaped the nightmare. But every night when he returned, the small apartment was immersed in heavy silence. The ticking of the clock rang clearly, and James felt that something was always watching him in the darkness. One evening, when James opened the drawer to get some documents, the phone lit up again without him touching it. The screen displayed a line of text, "We never left." James panicked and slammed the drawer shut, his heart pounding. But from that day on, things started to get worse. The app no longer emitted simple whispers. It began to create strange, haunted stories, recreating James's apartment with vivid sounds and images. The first night, as James sat reading, he heard a gentle knock on the door. He opened the door. The hallway was empty. But when he turned around, he saw an old photo on the table. In the photo was a boy with a pale face and deep black eyes. James had never seen this boy before, but in the corner of the photo was written, "James, too, 6 years old." A chill ran down his spine. He remembered that he had never taken such a photo as a child. But the voice from the phone rang out again, "We miss you." James shivered, threw the photo in the trash. But the next morning, it appeared on the table, right next to the cup of coffee he had just made. Not only that, James's apartment became more and more like a stage 4 haunted stories to reenact. Another night, he heard footsteps running in the living room. When he turned on the light, there was no one. But on the floor were wet footprints, stretching from the main door to the bedroom. James shivered, retreating to the corner, when his phone automatically turned on, shining directly at his face. On the screen, a figure stood in the room, a silhouette identical to his, but with a pale face and lifeless eyes. Mark visited James after hearing the story from his friend. He entered the apartment and immediately felt the heavy atmosphere. "This apartment is haunted," Mark whispered. "The app is not only tracking you, it's turning this whole place into a part of it." James panicked. "So what should I do now, Mark?" "I tried smashing it, trying to throw it away, but it always comes back." Mark was silent for a moment, then said, "Maybe you need to find out the origin of the app. What created it, why it is clinging to you. Without knowing the root, all ways to avoid it are useless." James agreed, although his heart was full of anxiety. That night, he turned on his phone again, actively facing it for the first time. He asked, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The screen shook, then distorted characters appeared. "We want to tell forgotten stories. Unheard souls." A voice came from the speaker, sometimes whispering, sometimes growling. "You will be the one to tell these haunted stories for us. If you refuse, we will tell them with your body." James was stunned, unable to believe what he was hearing. But deep down, he knew that those ghosts were using him as a means to survive. The haunted stories that came from the app were not just his memories, but also those of countless other lost souls. And they wouldn't stop until they were freed or dragged him down with them that night. James sat alone in his room, the phone right in front of him. He listened to each story told by different voices, by people he had never met. There was a woman's voice telling of an unjust death in a burning house, a man's voice wailing over betrayal, a child's voice crying for his mother, all mixed together, echoing in the dark apartment. James knew that his life would never be normal again. He was bound by the haunted stories from this damn app. But he also realized one thing: maybe the key to escape lay in those stories. And he had to find them, even if it meant going deeper into the darkness. James closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "If you want me to tell you, show me everything," he whispered. And immediately, the phone screen lit up, projecting terrifying images around the room. Shadowy ghosts began to gather, their empty eyes turned towards him. James knew that the real nightmare had only just begun. James sat motionless, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Over the past few nights, he had been awakened by the scary stories coming from his phone. They were no longer just meaningless whispers, but became terrifying stories so detailed that James felt like he was reliving each moment. One night, when the streetlights outside the window shone into the room, the app suddenly lit up. The screen was pitch black, except for a red dot that blinked like a heartbeat. Then, from the speaker, a woman's voice rang out, hoarse and trembling. I died right under this apartment." James froze, his heart pounding. The story continued, the voice telling of a terrible accident, of days of abandonment, and finally a lonely death in the very building James lived in. He felt the cold floor, as if the woman's breath still lingered under the tiles. When James bent down, the phone screen suddenly showed a dark room, exactly like his living room. But on the floor there was a large, slowly seeping bloodstain. James threw the phone away in panic, but it was still bright, emitting a loud knocking sound. At that moment, a real knocking sound came from outside the apartment door. James walked shakily closer, hesitantly opening the door. But the hallway was deserted. However, on the tiled floor, there were long, wet footprints leading from the door into the house. He quickly slammed the door shut, his heart about to jump out of his chest. The phone vibrated again, displaying the words, "We were here before you." The next day, James went to ask his neighbors. An old woman living downstairs looked at him with a distant gaze and sighed softly. "Did you know that there was a mysterious disappearance right in the apartment you were living in?" James turned pale, stammered a thank you, and then turned back. In his mind, the pieces began to connect, and he realized the scary stories weren't made up. At night, the app played a new story. This time, it was a child's voice. "I don't want to play anymore. Take me home." A sob rang out, and then an image appeared on the screen. A child standing in the middle of a dark room. His face pale, his big round eyes staring straight at James. He covered his face in panic, but the crying still echoed throughout the room. Unable to be stopped, James began to realize that these stories weren't just meant to scare him. They were like forgotten memories, souls calling for help through the app. But at the same time, he felt himself being sucked deeper into them, as if each story took up a new part of his mind. Another night, James tried recording himself, hoping to catch evidence. But when he played back, instead of hearing his own voice, he only heard a series of whispers in different voices. Among them, he recognized the repeated words, "You will be the last one." James lost his appetite and sleep, his mind gradually exhausted. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same creepy scenes. The blood-stained room, the mournful cries, the shadowy figure standing by the window staring at him. The once familiar apartment now became an unbearable place. Mark went back to visit James and was horrified to see his friend so emaciated that he could not recognize him. James recounted everything, his eyes wild. "They are telling scary stories about this very building. Mark, I think the unliberated souls are using the app to find a way to contact them." Mark grabbed James's shoulder. "If that's true, then you need to find a way to free them. But it's dangerous. They could take you with them." James nodded. Despite his fear, he knew that running away would not solve the problem. The app not only haunted him, but also turned him into a part of those creepy stories. And sooner or later, he would no longer be able to control himself. That night, James sat in a dark room, placing the phone right in front of him. He whispered softly, "Tell me the truth. I will listen to everything." The screen lit up. Then a voice rang out. "You were ready to be the last storyteller." James felt a cold air flow into the room. Thick darkness surrounded him. Ghostly images appeared everywhere, each soul crowded as if trying to spill out. And in that moment, James realized that the real nightmare had only just begun. James walked through the familiar apartment, but everything was different. The darkness in the corner of the room seemed thicker. The light bulbs flickered erratically, and the phone kept turning on and off as if it was breathing. Since he accepted to listen, creepy things continuously appeared around him, making life a long series of haunting days. One evening, James was washing dishes in the kitchen when a soft laugh sounded behind him. He turned around in surprise, seeing no one. But on the phone screen, placed in the living room, the image that appeared was not his apartment, but the kitchen where he was standing. In the corner of the image, a tall, thin figure with a blurry face stood right behind him. James rushed over, his heart pounding, but when he looked back at the real kitchen, there was nothing but darkness. He trembled and held his head, realizing that the app had begun to cross the boundary between the screen and reality. It was no longer just telling stories, but turning them into vivid scenes right before his eyes. That night, James fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted. In his daze, he heard a whisper close to his ear, "James, open your eyes." When he woke up, the living room was still silent, but the phone was right next to him. The screen was lit, showing his own face, but his eyes were empty and his mouth was smiling so wide it was terrifying. James threw the phone to the corner of the room, but it fell and slid back to him, brighter than before. The next day, James tried to leave the apartment, taking the phone with him to a crowded cafe to reassure himself that everything happened only when he was alone. But when he sat down, the phone screen showed the faces of everyone in the cafe, along with mysterious lines of text. A man was reading a newspaper. On the screen was the line, "He only has 2 days left." A woman was holding a baby. On the screen was the line, "She will cry forever." James panicked, quickly hiding the phone in his pocket. But those lines were still imprinted in his mind. When James got home, he noticed something even more terrifying. The voices from the app began to mimic the voices of the people he'd met at the bar. They told him secrets that James couldn't verify, but were enough to make him feel suffocated. The apartment was no longer a refuge, but a giant trap filled with unexplainable, creepy. Mark visited again, and this time he brought a few pages of documents. "I looked it up," Mark said, his voice serious. "The app doesn't exist on any official app store. It's like a wandering program, only available to certain people. There's a theory that it's made from recordings of unsolved crimes." James shook his head, his face pale. "I feel like they're using me to relive all their pain. Every night they tell me new stories, and I can't turn them off." Mark sighed. "If you listen, they will stick with you forever. But if you refuse, they may turn you into one of them." The words sent James into despair. He felt trapped between two choices that both led to darkness. That night, as he sat alone in his room, the phone lit up, and this time it was not just sound, but horrifying images that appeared directly on the wall. Headless figures, long arms clinging to the doorframe. All filled the apartment. James screamed, covering his ears, but the whispers still echoed. "You can't escape, James. We've been here since before you were born." The room swayed, the shadows closing in. In an instant, James collapsed to the floor, exhausted in a living nightmare. When he woke up, it was morning. Everything was quiet, but the phone was still on the table, the screen dimly lit. On it was a line of text, "We're just getting started." James trembled, realizing that there was no turning back. The creepy had infiltrated too deeply into his life, and there were more horrifying secrets ahead. James gradually realized that what he heard was no longer just vague stories. Every time the app turned on, it not only whispered in unfamiliar voices, but also recounted real events, cases and deaths that James could verify. These were true, scary stories. The macabre stories that had shocked the public, but had gradually been forgotten over time. One night, while he was trying to sleep, his phone lit up by itself, the screen showing an image of a small alley with dim yellow lights. A deep voice rang out. "I was murdered here in 1998. James sat up with a start, his heart pounding. The app detailed a murder in the neighborhood near where James lived, mentioning the victim's name and how he disappeared. The next morning, when James searched online, he was stunned to realize that the case had actually appeared in the press. And just as the app described, the killer had never been caught. James grew more frightened because each true scary story he heard seemed to be true. They were all tied to places around him, even in the same city. Another story was played back by a child's voice. Trembling and pained, I was left in the park, and no one came back to find me. At the same time, the screen showed an image of a swinging in the dark. James shuddered, because the park was only a few blocks from his apartment. Mark, hearing James's story, could only shake his head. It seems like this app is collecting all the ghost memories around you and turning them into true scary stories to force you to listen. James replied dejectedly, "But Mark, the terrible thing is that they are true. It's like a terrifying archive of souls that have never been heard." Another evening, James tried to confront it directly. He sat in a dark room, put the phone on the table and said, "If what you said is true, show me the proof." Immediately, the screen flashed, showing an image of an old room. A woman's voice rang out. "I was buried right under the floor." James looked at the screen in horror, where a pale hand reached out from the ground, too scared. James decided to go to the city library to look it up. There, he discovered many mysterious, unsolved disappearances, which matched what the app told. It seemed that the phone had become a channel connecting him with the unfortunate victims, but a more terrible truth was still waiting. One night, the app turned on while James was curled up in bed. This time, the voice that rang out was no longer unfamiliar, but Mark's. "James, I know you can't sleep. I know you're scared. But do you know I'm going to be one of these stories too?" James panicked and immediately called Mark, but his friend was still safe at home. However, the app displayed a specific date and time with the message. "Mark's memories are about to be recorded." James felt his blood freeze. The app not only recalled the stories that had happened, but also predicted upcoming deaths. He trembled and tried to delete the data, but the screen showed the message, "Can't delete the truth." From that day on, James lived in a state of obsession. Every time his phone lit up, he didn't know if he would hear a painful memory of the past or a predicted death in the future. The true scary stories were no longer distant stories, but were getting closer than ever. Surrounding the people he knew, James began to realize something terrible. He was not only a listener, but also a witness to events that had not yet happened. And if the app did not stop, his name might be the next one to be told in those chilling stories. He stared at the phone, whispering in despair, "Why me?" But the screen only flickered, then displayed the blood-red words, "Because you are the last one who can hear us." James understood that the nightmare was not over yet, and what awaited him ahead would be even more terrible. James began to notice a terrifying change in the way the app worked. If it had previously only recounted cases and distant memories, now it was creating haunted stories right in his daily life. It was no longer old events, but each present moment was turned into a haunting story. making James not know what was real and what was imaginary. One night, James had just sat down on the sofa when his phone lit up. On the screen, the words appeared. Story of the night. The man in the third-floor apartment. James frowned, because the third-floor apartment was where he lived. Immediately after, the app played a voice that sounded exactly like his own, but cold and echoing. He is not alone. James's heart sank. He immediately looked around. The room was still dark and silent, but he felt like someone was standing in the corner of the room. Then the screen showed an image of his living room, but with a different detail. On the opposite chair, there was a figure sitting there, head slightly bowed, long hair covering his face. James turned around. The chair was empty. But when he looked back at the screen, the figure raised its head, its dark eyes staring straight at him. James shivered, immediately turned off the phone. But the screen was still on, the image still projected, like a distorted mirror reflecting the haunting reality. The next day, James decided to take the phone out, hoping that when he left the apartment, the haunted stories would disappear. But when he sat in the park, the screen lit up again, this time showing the bench he was sitting on. In the image, right next to him, was a child sitting silently, holding a tattered teddy bear. But in real life, the chair next to him was empty. A voice rang out. "This boy has been waiting for someone for the past 10 years. James trembled, not daring to sit for long, and hurriedly left. Back at the apartment, James found things getting worse. The stories were no longer just on the screen, but began to leave traces everywhere. One morning, he saw faint handwritten lines on the bedroom wall. "Tell us." He wiped them away with a towel. But after a few minutes, the words reappeared, even darker. Mark came over and saw what James had told him with his own eyes. He no longer doubted, just sighed. They are no longer limited to the app. This apartment has become a haven for those haunted stories. James, you must find a way to face them, otherwise, they will turn you into one of them. James was desperate, but he also realized the truth. Every story he heard contained incomplete pieces. It was as if those spirits were trying to pass him a message, a secret that had never been revealed. But the price he had to pay was that he was increasingly losing his boundaries with reality. Another night, James woke up at 3 in the morning, the room in darkness. Whispers were everywhere, this time not just from the phone, but from every corner of the house. He turned on the light, but the light immediately flickered and went out. In the darkness, he saw silhouettes moving back and forth, as if the apartment was filled with invisible guests. The phone lit up, displaying dozens of faces stacked on top of each other, all staring at him. James collapsed, his ears ringing from the constant whispering. He realized that the haunted stories were no longer just stories, but had become pieces of life that crept into his life bit by bit. In desperation, he shouted, "If you want me to tell you again, then tell me the whole truth." The phone lit up. This time, no longer a fragmented image, but a whole series of dark memories intertwined. James saw a group of people, saw strange rituals in the dark room, saw hands placing the phone down like a sacrifice. James's heart pounded. He understood that the origin of the app was not random. It was the product of a ritual, an open door for the spirits to tell their stories. And now, James had become the keeper of that door. He covered his face, not knowing how to escape this horrible fate. But he knew one thing for sure. There were still many haunted stories, and they would continue to tell them until the truth was finally revealed. James gradually realized that what the app was telling was no longer just whispering ghosts or mysterious disappearances. This time, it brought up true horror stories, terrifying events that had happened, hidden under the dust of time. Every time the screen lit up, James not only heard voices, but also saw terrifying images as if projected directly into his mind. One night, while James was sitting in his office, his phone vibrated violently. The screen lit up. It showed a scene of an old room with moldy walls. A voice rang out, broken but clear. "In this place, we were locked." No one heard the cry for help. James shuddered. Then the image changed to a scene of a group of people being held captive, their eyes looking desperately at the screen. James's heart clenched. Cold sweat ran down his back. He typed in information and discovered that the incident had actually happened in the past, but the press only reported it briefly and then disappeared. No one knows what the victims really went through, and now they're using the app to tell the truth. James gradually realized that the app was like a giant diary recording the true horror stories of abandoned souls. A fire, a murder, unjust deaths, all of them replayed in his apartment. The images not only appeared on the screen, but also spread around. One evening, he walked into his bedroom and saw on the mirror an image of a burning room, billowing black smoke and a figure screaming for help. He quickly rubbed his eyes. The image disappeared, but the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. Mark came over, listening to James's story, stunned. "This app is more than just a conduit, James. It's a door for the horror stories to come back. Every time you listen, you're helping them survive, but at the same time, they're taking over you." James bowed his head, his voice trembling. "But if I don't listen, they will never be freed. They will continue to haunt me until I can't take it anymore." In the following days, James lived in a state of conflict. Every time his phone lit up, he trembled, not daring to look, but he couldn't resist. The app began to intersperse scenes from the future. One time, it showed an image of James himself, lying motionless in his apartment, surrounded by shadows. The text on the screen read, "This will be the next story." James panicked, threw his phone to the ground. But when he picked it up, the screen was still on. The text was still there. The apartment now became a haunted theater where true horror stories followed one another. At night, there were women crying. In the morning, there were children laughing. James was sleepless. His body was emaciated. His eyes were dark. He realized that he was no longer a mere listener, but was being swallowed by the stories themselves. Another night, the app played a familiar voice. "James, you can't escape. Even your friend Mark will soon be part of the story." James's heart sank, and he immediately called Mark, but the call was filled with static and whispers. The phone screen showed Mark sitting in the apartment, but behind him were silhouettes hovering. James screamed, but no one answered. He understood that the app was not just telling, but creating its own truth. It could turn everything into a part of the true horror stories it was building. James felt like a puppet, dragged into a never-ending game of evil in desperation. He knelt down, gasping for breath. "What do you want from me?" The screen flashed, showing the words, "Continue until the final story ends." James looked up, tears streaming down his face. He knew he didn't have much time left. True horror stories surrounded him, and the only way was to move forward, even if the abyss lay ahead. James no longer recognized himself. His body was emaciated, his eyes sunken, his skin pale from sleepless nights. Every time the light from his phone flashed, his heart stopped. because he knew another story was about to be told. One of those haunting, creepy stories that would consume his mind that night. The clock read to AM. The apartment was so quiet that James could hear his heart beating. The phone on the table vibrated slightly and then lit up, projecting an image of a long, dark hallway. A whisper sounded. "This apartment is not just yours." James shivered, slowly looking around. The hallway in the picture was exactly the same as the real one, except for one thing on the screen at the end of the hallway. There was a silhouette of a person standing motionless. James rushed to open the door, but the real hallway was completely empty. When he turned back, the phone vibrated again, and the silhouette had moved closer, only a few steps away. James held his head, slumped down, not daring to look anymore. But the whisper still echoed in the room. "Can you hear us?" The next day, James tried not to touch his phone. He put it in a metal box, locked it, and stuffed it under the bed. But at night, a slight vibration sounded from under the bed. He glanced at it, and in the darkness, the blue light from the screen shone out, clearly showing the words, "You can't hold the story." The app began to turn every place James went into a stage for creepy stories. At the supermarket, he saw his reflection in the mirror not in sync with his own. In the elevator, the speakers emitted strange whispers. On the bus, he smelled a familiar, musty smell, then saw on the phone screen the words, "One of them was here." Mark visited James and was extremely worried. His best friend looked at James like a shadow of himself. James said hoarsely, "They're telling creepy stories in every way, Mark. They don't need phones anymore. They're using the world around me." Mark said sternly, "If so, this is out of control. You have to find the source of this app, or they'll wipe you out." James nodded, but his heart was filled with fear. He decided to try talking to the app one more time. That night, he took out his phone, placed it in the middle of the room, and whispered, "If you want me to tell you, tell me where you came from." The screen lit up, showing a dark room with a circle drawn in blood. A multi-pitched voice rang out at the same time. "We come from buried stories, from memories that were never told. You are the one chosen to be the last one." James felt cold, knowing that he had become part of some kind of ritual. From that day on, James heard more than just voices. He began to see shadowy figures in the apartment, moving round. One time, when he opened the refrigerator, he found not food inside, but a cold room where a woman was sitting huddled, her eyes staring at him blankly. He quickly closed the door, opened it again, and found it was just a normal drawer. But the musty smell was still there, lingering around. The apartment became hell. The creepy stories were no longer confined to sounds or images, but had entered real life. James could not separate himself from them. He began to write down each story he heard, hoping to find a clue. But each time he wrote, distorted characters automatically appeared on the page, as if an invisible hand was writing with him. Another night, when James collapsed, exhausted on the table, the phone lit up, emitting a booming voice. "If you stop, you will become another story. We will tell you about you, James." He woke up, his whole body shaking. In that moment, he realized he had two choices: either continue listening and recording, or let himself become a creepy story. James held his head, choking in the darkness. He whispered, "I don't want to, but I can't escape." And at that moment, his phone displayed the message, "I have no choice." James knew that the nightmare had only just begun. The creepy stories continued, and he had become the center of it all. James thought he was used to the long, detailed, creepy stories. But then he noticed the app started to change the way it told them. Instead of presenting complex stories, it started to create short, scary stories, short but sharp as a knife, stabbing straight into his mind. One night, his phone turned on, showing only a line of text. "There is someone standing right behind you." James startled and turned around. The room was empty. But the next second, he heard a soft breathing sound behind his neck. He turned on the light. No one was there. The text on the screen disappeared, replaced by another sentence. "You missed it." These short, scary stories appeared at any time. While James was eating breakfast, the screen showed, "Don't drink that cup." He panicked and threw the cup on the floor, spilling coffee. When he looked back, the text was gone. Another time, while entering the elevator, the screen said, "The door will not open again." His heart clenched, sweat poured out, but the door still opened. James realized he was slowly being pushed into a state of paranoia. The app didn't stop at warnings. It also released short audio clips. Children's laughter rang out in the dark. A woman's whisper in his ear, "James, you belong to us." The audio clips were short but haunting. Keeping James from sleeping, Mark went to see James, surprised to see his friend haggard. James recounted everything, his eyes glaring. "They don't tell long stories anymore. Now they make short, scary stories. But every time I read them, I feel like I'm going crazy." Mark was silent for a moment, then replied, "Maybe they're testing your limits. Short stories are easier to remember, faster, and you don't have time to resist." James nodded, feeling desperate. He started to move away from the phone, but to no avail. One morning, he saw short lines appear on the bathroom mirror, as if written in steam. "You will be the next story." James panicked, wiped them away with a towel, but a few seconds later, the words appeared again, darker, that night. James heard a knock on the door. When he opened it, the hallway was empty, but his phone lit up, showing the words, "You just invited him in." James slammed the door shut, his heart pounding, cold sweat breaking out all over his body. He retreated to the corner of the room, clutching his head, but in his ears still echoed a whisper, "We are here." James began to write everything down, hoping to retain some semblance of sanity. He wrote each word the app gave him, but the more he wrote, the more he saw that these short, scary stories were connected, forming a larger picture, a secret he did not yet fully understand. They were not random, but pieces of a puzzle. Once, the app showed the words, "You will die at 3 a.m. James looked at the clock. It was 2:57. His heart stopped beating. He curled up on the bed, his eyes glued to the clock hands. When the hands pointed to 3 o'clock, the lights in the room suddenly turned off. Darkness engulfed everything. James screamed loudly, his heart pounding as if it was about to burst. A minute later, the lights came back on. Everything was quiet, as if nothing had happened. The phone only showed the words, "Next time will be more real." James knew that the app was testing his patience, slowly turning him into a puppet for the stories. He was afraid that sooner or later he would no longer be able to distinguish between the truth and the short, scary stories created by the app dot sitting in the dark. James whispered, "If you want me to tell you, show me the whole thing." The phone screen lit up, displaying dozens of overlapping short lines. "You heard. You saw. You will become a part of us." James felt like he was falling into an abyss, with no way out. The short, scary stories, though short, penetrated deeply into his mind, turning his life into a never-ending nightmare. James sat blankly by the window, the pale light of the night covering his haggard face. He had experienced all kinds of creepy stories and short, scary stories. But this time, the app brought him to a new threshold: paranormal stories. They were not just fragments of memories or warnings, but supernatural phenomena that directly broke the boundary between the two worlds. That night, the phone vibrated, emitting a soft but creepy blue light. On the screen was no longer just a single line of text or image, but a scene that seemed to be filmed live. James's own apartment, but everything was distorted as if reflected in a broken mirror. In that scene, there was another James sitting motionless on the sofa, his eyes empty. A voice rang out. "This is a parallel world, where what is forgotten will live forever." James choked, feeling like a cold hand had just touched his shoulder from that moment. The paranormal stories began to surround him. As James walked down the hallway, he heard footsteps behind him, but every time he turned around, there was no one. In the bathroom, the mirror reflected a different space. In it, the room was dark. Behind him stood a silhouette. Once, when he looked down at the tiled floor, he saw a pair of bare, bloody feet imprinted on the floor. But when he bent down to touch them, they disappeared. Mark listened to James, his face tense. "You're not just listening to stories anymore, James. You're living paranormal stories. This app is no longer just a playback. It's warping reality around you." James cried out in despair. "I don't want to live this nightmare anymore, Mark, but they won't let me out." In the following days, James no longer knew where he was. During the day, he walked out into the street, but saw people moving slowly, like in a broken film. Sometimes he heard someone calling his name in the crowd, but when he turned around, he saw only unfamiliar faces. The phone in his pocket vibrated constantly, and each time he opened it, a short clip of a parallel world appeared, where James saw himself dying in various ways. One night, as James drifted off to sleep, he dreamed that he was pulled into the phone screen. On the other side was an endless hallway, dimly lit by a pale blue light. On both sides of the hallway, dozens of closed doors. Behind each door were whispers for help, cries, and urgent knocking. James walked tremblingly, but every time he approached a door, a voice rang out, "Don't open, or you won't be able to go back." He woke up, drenched in sweat, but when he looked down, the phone in his hand was still lit, showing the exact hallway in his dream. James understood that he could no longer distinguish between dreams and reality. The paranormal stories had taken over all his senses. He was no longer just a listener, but had become a part of the story. In desperation, James tried to destroy the phone again. He smashed it with a hammer, threw it down the stairs, even burned it in a fire. But every morning, it would appear intact on the table, the screen lit up as if mocking him. A line appeared. "You cannot undo what has begun," Mark suggested. "Maybe you should find the place where this app was born. If it really originated from a ritual, then only there will you have a chance to cut it off." James hesitated, but knew that there was no other way. He agreed to search with Mark Dot. On the last night before leaving, the app lit up again. The screen showed James's own distorted face, his black eyes empty. A cold voice rang out, "You will not return, because you will be our biggest story." James held his head, his heart heavy. He knew that the journey ahead was not only dangerous, but could also cause him to lose himself forever. But he also understood one thing: these paranormal stories would not stop unless he faced them to the end. James and Mark sat in a dark room, their phones glowing brightly in the middle of the table. The blue light from the screen spread out, reflecting on their anxious faces. Mark whispered, "James, are you sure this is the right path?" James remained silent, his eyes glued to the screen as if hypnotized. Over the past few days, he had heard all kinds of paranormal stories, and now the app was turning them into moving images, just like animated horror stories that were vivid but terrifying. On the screen, the drawings initially appeared as scribbles, but then each stroke overlapped, turning into human figures, incomplete faces, large, lifeless eyes. They moved, breathing heavily, then turned to look straight out of the screen. James stepped back, but Mark held his shoulder, his voice trembling. "This is no longer an illusion. They are really coming out of the screen." Indeed, the cartoon images began to spill out, clinging to the walls, crawling on the ceiling. The small room quickly transformed into a twisted world where reality and cartoon merged. A figure drawn in black, squiggly lines approached James, its mouth open but no sound coming out. Instead, the phone rang with a whisper, "You are next." James trembled, his heart pounding. He shouted, "I do not want to be a part of your animated horror stories." The screen immediately shook. Distorted words appeared. "You have no choice." Mark gripped the phone, trying to turn it off. But instead of turning it off, the screen showed an image of Mark, his eyes bloodshot, smiling faintly. The image stared at the real Mark and said, "You have been in here for a long time." Mark flinched, throwing the phone to the ground, but it only vibrated and continued to glow like an indestructible living creature. The room shook. The distorted animations continued to move, morphing into all sorts of strange shapes. A monster with many eyes crawled out of the screen, its body incomplete, sometimes like ink drawings, sometimes like real life. James and Mark retreated towards the door, but it had long since been locked. In desperation, James shouted, "Why me?" The phone screen displayed the words, "Because you are the only one who can hear." Immediately, the animated horror stories turned into a storm of images, throwing the whole room into chaos. James saw himself appearing in the animation, his face stretched, his body twisted, becoming a character among the other distorted beings. Mark tried to keep James awake. "Don't look at it, James. It wants to make you part of its world." James closed his eyes tightly, but the sounds echoed in his head. Distorted laughter, creepy footsteps, and a familiar voice. "You can't escape." A moment later, the light suddenly went out. The phone screen was dark. The room returned to normal, leaving only James and Mark panting in the darkness. James held his head, his voice trembling. "Mark, they have gone one step further. If this continues, I don't know if we are still human beings." Mark nodded, his eyes determined. "Then we must act before it is too late. If the origin of the app lies in some kind of ritual, we must find the place where it was created. There, we may be able to find a way to destroy it." James clenched his fists, his eyes shining with fear and determination. He understood that the road ahead was full of danger, but there was no other choice. The animated horror stories had shown the terrifying power of the app, and if they did not stop it, the entire world might be submerged. After a night of horror with vivid animated horror stories coming out of the screen, James and Mark knew that time was running out. Mark had to leave to look for more documents about the origin of the app, and James stayed in the apartment alone. For the first time in many days, he felt absolute silence. But that silence was not peaceful, but like a thin curtain before a storm. James sat on the sofa, his phone placed in front of him. He tried not to touch it, but the blue light from the screen kept flashing as if inviting. He whispered to himself, "Just endure one night. Mark will come back tomorrow." But the fear of being home alone crept into every breath. When the clock pointed to almost midnight, the phone vibrated. A short line appeared on the screen. "You are not really alone." James swallowed, his eyes looking around the apartment. The room was silent, but he clearly felt someone's eyes watching him. He rushed to check every window, every door, but everything was locked. Returning to the living room, he was stunned to see that the chair opposite him had a dent, as if someone had just sat there. He sat down trembling, his hands clutching his head. The phone lit up again, this time showing an image of his own apartment, but with a horrifying detail. A tall, thin figure sitting in the exact spot opposite. James stared, then turned to the real chair, empty. But when he looked back at the screen, the figure slowly turned its head, its empty black eyes staring straight at him. James shouted, turning the phone off, but the sound still echoed in the room. "We were here before you." His heart pounded, cold sweat running down his forehead. He rushed into the bedroom, locking the door, hoping to distance himself from the whisper. But as soon as he leaned back against the door, the phone lit up on the bedside table. He clearly remembered leaving it in the living room, so why was it here? The screen showed another scene. James was sleeping in the same position he was sitting, and right next to the bed, a figure stood still, head tilted to one side. James held his breath, not daring to look over. The sound of footsteps echoed softly, as if someone was moving in the dark room. He hugged his head tightly, closed his eyes, and whispered, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But a voice rang right next to his ear. "If you don't believe it, open your eyes." James jumped up, rushed to turn on the light. The room was bright, empty, but the phone displayed a bright red line. "You just missed the chance to see us." That night at home alone seemed endless. James sat huddled, not daring to sleep. Every small sound startled him. After a while, he heard whispers from the kitchen. When he walked over, the light turned on automatically, and an old piece of paper appeared on the dining table. On it were hastily written words, "Don't let them tell the story for you." James trembled, picked up the paper, but as soon as he touched it, it vanished like dust. He returned to the living room in a daze. His phone lit up for the last time in the night, showing an image of him standing in this very apartment, his eyes lifeless, his mouth whispering non-stop. Below that image were the words, "This will be your story." James held his head, feeling as if the entire apartment was shrinking, as if it wanted to swallow him. He knew that tonight was just the beginning. These home alone phenomena would continue, increasingly intense, until he was no longer himself. The apartment was dark, except for the dim light from the streetlight outside the window. James sat with his back against the wall, his body exhausted after a terrible night at home alone. He tried to close his eyes, but the wind howled outside the window and the sky began to cloud over, signaling a heavy rain. When the first raindrops pattered on the glass, James thought that at least the sound of the rain could cover up the deathly silence. But he was wrong. The sound of the rain was steady and gentle at first, then gradually became strange. In the rhythm of the rain, James heard other sounds mixed in. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, sometimes like tapping. James pressed his ear to the glass, listening more closely. His heart turned cold when he realized, amidst the familiar rain sounds, there was a faint whisper. He stepped back, eyes wide open, staring at the night outside the window. The rain ran down the glass pane, creating distorted streaks. For a moment, James saw a blurry face pressed against the glass, lips moving as if calling his name. He jumped back in surprise, but the face disappeared as soon as he blinked. The phone on the table vibrated. The screen lit up, displaying the words, "Can you hear us in the rain?" James held the phone tremblingly, his mouth stammering, "What do you want from me?" The app immediately played the sound of falling rain, but this time it was interspersed with the sobbing of a child. The crying mixed with the rain sounds created a creepy melody echoing throughout the room. James held his head, trying to cover his ears, but the sound still echoed in his mind. He rushed to close the window, but the sound of rain became more intense, as if thousands of hands were tapping on the glass at the same time. The phone continued to display short sentences. "We are drowning in the rain. Listen to our story. You can't escape." Mark called James, his voice urgent. "I just found information. There is a group that created this app by recording the last sounds from crime scenes. James, you have to be careful, because the sound of rain might be how they find their way back." James replied shakily, "Mark, I can hear them in the sound of rain. They are tapping on my window." Before Mark could answer, the line flickered and then cut off. James looked up, saw the window shaking violently, each drop of rain splashing in, creating a chaotic sound. He gathered all his courage and walked over, pulling the curtain back. But as soon as the curtain was down, the phone made the sound of rain falling, accompanied by a soft laugh. "The curtain can't cover us." James was desperate and collapsed. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sounds, but the harder he tried, the louder they became. In the sound of rain, he heard each short story, each whisper. "I drowned in this rainy night. I was left outside in the pouring rain." The sound of the rain drowned out my screams. The words mixed with the sound of the rain made James choke. He began to realize something. The spirits were using rain sounds to tell their deaths. They were buried under the rains of the past, and now they were coming back through the app. James shakily wrote down what he heard, but his hands kept shaking. Suddenly, the phone showed an image of the apartment window. There, beyond the rain, were dozens of faces pressed against the glass, all staring at him. James panicked, rushed to pull open the curtains, but in real life, the window was empty, only the heavy rain. He stepped back, his heart pounding, but when he looked at the screen, the faces were still there, their lips whispering in unison, "James." He knew that the night had only just begun. The familiar sound of rain had now become a nightmare. The rain sounds no longer bring peace, but are the key that opens the door to souls that never rest. James sat in the dark room, the light from the phone screen shining on his haggard face. After the haunting rainy night, he thought he would be more peaceful, but no, the app took a new step. This time, it not only told the stories of anonymous souls, but also began to recreate creepypastas, scary stories that only existed online. The phone vibrated. On the screen appeared the words, "Do you remember the stories you read at night, James?" He trembled, because when he was young, he used to be passionate about reading a series of creepypastas on forums. They were just fiction, but now the app started to turn them into reality right before his eyes. The screen displayed an image of a long hallway, flashing lights. Then a tall, thin figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Without the app's introduction, James immediately knew that image, a haunting character that had once made waves online. But this time, it was not just in the written page. James heard footsteps echoing through his own apartment. He rushed out into the hallway, only to see the lights flickering erratically, and his heart pounding with fear. Another night. The app projected a distorted, eyeless face with a wide smile. And on the screen read, "Do you remember me, James?" His heart sank, because that was the image he had read in a famous creepypasta. But now, it was more than just fiction. In the darkness, James heard a distorted, long-lasting laugh echoing throughout the apartment. He began to understand that the app had exploited the haunting stories that people had created on the internet and turned them into real supernatural phenomena. Creepypastas that had seemed like entertainment had now become a curse that haunted him. Mark turned and looked at James with worried eyes. "You look like a lost soul, James. What's going on?" James replied with a trembling voice, "Mark, they're not just telling real stories. Now they're taking creepypastas, things we used to consider fictional, and turning them into reality. I've seen them in my own apartment." Mark was stunned. If that's true, then this app is not only connecting with spirits, but also sucking out collective fear from people. It's turning all the hauntings into reality. James hung his head. Desperate, "I can't escape, Mark. Whether it's fictional or real, they're all around me." That night, James decided to test the app. He opened his phone and said loudly, "If you want to turn creepypastas into reality, show me the whole thing." The screen lit up. A series of images flooded out. A tall, thin figure in the forest, a white-faced, long-haired girl standing behind her, a face without eyes smiling eerily. All of them overlapped, forming a vivid nightmare. The apartment turned into a monstrous stage. The walls were distorted, the mirrors reflected James's distorted image, and the sound of crawling footsteps echoed from the ceiling. Voices rang out from everywhere. "You invited us here. Now you can't escape." James collapsed, holding his head in despair. When the light from the phone went out, the room returned to normal. But James knew clearly that this was not the end. The app had opened a new door, where the boundary between fiction and reality dissolved. The creepypastas were no longer just stories on the internet, but had entered his world, turning his life into a living nightmare. James looked at Mark with trembling eyes, his voice hoarse. "If it can turn even fictional stories into reality, then how can we resist?" Mark clenched his fists, his eyes solemn. "We have to find a place where it all began. No matter the price, we have to close this door." James nodded, but deep down he knew the journey ahead would be even more terrifying. The creepypasta was just the beginning of something far more horrifying. James and Mark decided to leave the city for a few days. They hoped that by going far away from the haunted apartment, the app would lose control. Mark chose a forest far away from the center, where there was only the sound of wind and insects, to camp. James nodded, harboring a faint hope that in the middle of nature, the app would be silent. That afternoon, they set up a tent by a stream. The golden sunlight of the late afternoon shone through the leaves. The sound of running water made James somewhat comfortable. He sat watching the sky gradually turn purple, thinking to himself, Maybe I can sleep peacefully here. Mark lit a fire. The two sat by the flickering fire, telling stories to forget the haunting. But when night fell, the forest became unusually gloomy. The sound of insects echoed evenly, but mixed with something unusual. James glanced at the phone in his pocket, praying that it wouldn't light up. But just as the wind whistled through the treetops, the phone vibrated slightly. James pulled it out, the screen displaying the words, "Tonight, there are more than two people." James's heart pounded. He handed the phone to Mark. They both looked at each other, their faces pale. Mark lowered his voice. "It could be a psychological trick. Don't look at it anymore." James nodded, but a feeling of unease rose. They crept into the tent. The crackling of the fire outside gradually faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Suddenly, James heard footsteps on the carpet of leaves, slowly approaching. He held his breath, looking at Mark, but his friend heard it too. They both took flashlights and peeked out, but there was no one. Only the shadows of trees trembling in the night wind. When James returned to the tent, he saw that his phone was lit up, even though he was sure it had been turned off. The screen showed a group of people sitting around a fire exactly like them, but with three more dark figures standing behind them, motionless, silently watching. Below the image was the text, "They came before." James's spine shivered. He rushed out to check again, but all around was thick darkness. The night wind howled louder, shaking the treetops. When he turned back, Mark pointed at the phone screen, trembling. "James, look." In the scene, one of the three dark figures began to move towards the two people sitting around the fire. But in reality, there were only two of them. That night became a nightmare. Footsteps kept echoing round the tent, sometimes stopping right outside. James held his breath, his heart almost jumping out of his chest. Then the phone let out a twisted laugh, the sound echoing through the forest as if dozens of people were standing around them. Mark whispered, "We can't let it control us anymore. We have to leave tomorrow." James nodded, but in his heart he doubted. Would they still be able to escape tomorrow? Because the app now didn't need a city, didn't need an apartment. It could haunt right in the middle of this desolate forest. When the clock was almost 3 a.m., James dozed off for a bit. But he dreamed that he walked out of the tent, following the light from his phone. In his dream, he saw dozens of figures standing around the edge of the forest, all staring at him. A voice echoed, "We won't let you leave." James woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. He looked over, the phone in his hand was glowing, displaying the exact scene from his dream. Mark shook James, worried. "James, are you okay?" James gasped. "They followed us here. There's no safe place left." Both of them understood that the camping trip that was supposed to be a peaceful one had now turned into a trap. The entities in the app were not only attached to places, but were clinging to James, going anywhere, telling any story. Dawn was breaking, but James and Mark didn't feel any safer. After a haunting camping night, the two decided to go deeper into the forest. They believed that if the app had its origins in a ritual, clues would surely appear in this desolate place. But the deeper they went, the more James felt the air thicken, and every gust of wind carried an indescribable heaviness. Mark walked ahead with the flashlight. James followed, his hand clutching his phone. Strangely, the screen was still on, even though he hadn't turned it on. It displayed a map of the forest, with a red dot moving with them. But what made James shiver was that other red dots began to appear, surrounding them. His voice trembled. "Mark, we're not alone." The sounds in the forest became strange. The birds stopped singing, the insects fell silent. Instead, there were whispers echoing from many directions, like dozens of people were talking, but no one could see their faces. James swung the flashlight around, but the light only shone on the twisted old tree trunks. However, every time the light swept past, he caught a glimpse of people leaning against the tree trunks, just silently watching. They came to an open space. In the middle was a large rock, on which were carved faint characters. James's phone vibrated, displaying an image of the same rock, but with a red streak like blood. The words appeared. "This is where it all began." Mark touched the rock and whispered, "James, this place has been haunted for a long time. Perhaps the ritual to create the app was performed here." At that moment, the wind picked up. The leaves rustled violently. James heard the echoes of laughter, children, women, and men. They echoed from all directions, echoing straight into his mind. The phone screen lit up, showing dozens of ghosts surrounding the rock. James looked up and was horrified to see that the shadowy figures were indeed standing in a circle around them. Mark pulled James back, shouting, "Don't look into their eyes," but James couldn't look away. One of the ghosts stepped closer, his face blurry but his eyes empty. It opened its mouth, but instead of a scream, a voice came straight from the phone. "You brought us here." James panicked. "I don't want to. I don't choose." The screen replied with the words, "You listened. And when you listened, the door opened." The ghosts began to move closer. The trees around them shook violently, their branches swaying as if by an invisible hand. A large tree fell down right next to them, but when the dust cleared, James realized it was still standing, as if it had never moved. The line between reality and fantasy was blurred, driving James almost insane. Mark squeezed James's hand, trying to pull him out of the circle. The two of them ran as fast as they could through the dark paths, the strange footsteps following them. Every time they turned around, James could see a series of eyes following them. The whispers kept ringing out, "You can't escape this haunted forest." Finally, they rushed to a dry stream. James fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The phone fell to the ground, a long crack on the screen. But instead of turning off, it showed James and Mark sitting in their current positions, and behind them, a tall figure standing still. James turned around in shock. It was empty. But the screen continued to flash. The red words appeared. "It's very close." James covered his face, his heart pounding, and Mark squeezed his friend's arm, his voice trembling. "We have to leave this place before there's no way back." But James understood. This haunted forest was not easy to escape. Once they entered, they became part of the dark story that the app was continuing to write. James and Mark sat exhausted by the stream, breathing heavily. They thought they would be safer if they ran away from the haunted clearing, but the truth was completely different. James's phone, despite its cracked screen, still lit up, emitting faint whispers from dozens of people. The screen gradually revealed clear images, no longer blurry or distorted like before. They were real scenes, old documentary footage. A burning house, people screaming, a dark alley with flashing lights, and a shocking attack. A riverbank where the police had found an unidentified body. Under each image, the phone displayed a short text. "These are true stories." James held his head, whispering, "No, I don't want to see anymore." But the phone vibrated violently, forcing him to look. The whispers rang out in unison. "You are the only one who can tell the truth." Mark gripped his friend's shoulder and growled, "James, you have to wake up. These are no longer made-up stories. They are showing you the truth that people have tried to bury." James trembled as he looked at the screen. A short video appeared, showing the forest they were standing in. A voice rang out, "In this place, many people have gone missing. We are part of those true stories." James's heart tightened. He remembered the vague news about the disappearances that the press only mentioned in passing. Now, the app exposed everything before his eyes. Suddenly, a middle-aged man's face appeared. His eyes were empty. His voice rang out from the phone speaker. "I was buried right under the rock you just touched." James shuddered. Because yesterday, Mark had placed his hand on the rock with strange characters engraved on it. Mark clenched his fist and whispered, "If that's true, this forest is a graveyard of secrets that have never been revealed." The two decided to follow the map on the screen. The red dots moved, leading them deeper into the forest. When they reached a swampy area, the phone vibrated, showing a picture of a woman in a white dress. Her voice trembling, "I was left here on a rainy night." James looked around. It was the same spot. The swamp was soggy. The smell of mold was strong. He backed away, his face pale. Mark pulled James forward, but their steps became heavier. The darkness in the forest seemed to swallow the flashlight. Then suddenly, the phone made a knocking sound like a door being knocked, urgent, intense. The screen showed a small room where many people were locked tightly, their eyes looking out in despair. A voice rang out, "Tell us. If not, you will be next." James burst into tears, screaming, "I can't bear all these true stories." But the screen showed a red line. "You have to, because the truth cannot be buried forever." The wind whistled through the trees, and a distorted laugh echoed everywhere. Mark held James tightly, his voice faltering. "We have to end this. There is no turning back." James nodded, but his heart was filled with fear. He understood that the app was not just a bridge to the soul, but a door to dig up all the forgotten memories. And when these true stories were exposed, the real world might never be the same again. James looked at his phone and saw a new message appear. "The final destination is waiting. Are you ready?" James and Mark walked deeper into the forest, the flashlight flickering to light the way. The cold air enveloped them, each step heavy as if the ground was trying to hold them back. The phone in James's hand vibrated continuously. The screen cracked, but the blue light still shone out, guiding them to a strange flat land. In the middle was a large ancient rock, covered in moss, surrounded by wild grass. The screen was bright, showing footage from where they were standing. But in the picture, there were dozens of blurry figures surrounding them. The voice rang out, no longer trembling or pleading, but filled with hatred. "This is where we wait. These are revenge stories that you are forced to hear." James shuddered, swallowing hard. Each voice spoke, recounting unjust deaths. A man growled, "I was betrayed by my best friend." A woman sobbed, "I was left until the rain drowned me." A child whispered, "I died because of a promise that was never kept." The stories were not just memories, but accusations. Filled with hatred, Mark squeezed James's shoulder. "This is not just a retelling anymore. They want revenge." Indeed, the voices rang out in unison. "If the truth is not revealed, we will make you a replacement." The phone vibrated violently. James's image appeared on the screen. but his eyes were black, his face was distorted. The red words appeared. You will be a witness and also a victim. James stepped back, but his feet seemed to be pinned to the ground. Suddenly, the wind blew. The leaves swirled violently into circles. Blurry figures appeared from everywhere, walking towards the two. James shouted, "I don't want to hear any more." But the voices combined into a shocking echo. No one is allowed to be silent before these revenge stories. Mark pulled James back, but the ancient stone glowed, and blood-red characters appeared on its surface. The phone synchronized, displaying the words, "We have begun. There is no stopping." James felt his heart pounding, his ears ringing with the screams. He saw flashing images, each betrayal, each hateful gaze, each hand reaching out from the darkness. All rolled into a fierce tornado, spinning straight at him in desperation. James knelt down, shouting, "What do you want from me?" The voices rang out in unison, this time not as a plea for help, but as a command. "Tell me everything. Let the world know we exist. If not, you will replace us in the next revenge stories." Mark pulled James to his feet, and the two of them rushed out of the clearing, their hearts pounding. But no matter how far they ran, the whispers followed, like wind in the branches. "You can't escape. You belong to us." James understood that the app had reached its limit. It was no longer just a storytelling tool, but a place for bloodthirsty souls, people hungry for revenge. And he was the only bridge.